we are looking at atypical nervous systems. Like we're looking at kids, each kid having a different nervous system. That's the facts. Each kid actually has a profoundly unique nervous system. Thank God.
Yeah, thank God, yeah.
And so when you're in a situation where the unique nervous system doesn't necessarily fit well in the standardized container, then you either need to blame the container or blame the nervous system, right? So a lot of what's happening with the ADHD kind of crisis, and if you look at the numbers of the kind of escalating diagnosis and the diagnostic creep and the numbers of prescriptions, it's a large number of kids over a short period of time. And the numbers are actually in my book. I document the actual numbers and the billions being made by companies selling Ritalin, direct to consumer advertisement as part of that, at least in the United States. But what you're looking at is a tendency to want to avert attention from critique of the forms of schooling and put attention on the biological substrate of the individual, right? Which is to say that if school is not working for you, right, is it because you have a disease-like problem with your brain that's probably genetic, right? Which is, at the end of the day, the story about ADHD is turning into some story about genetically ingrained differences in neurological maturation, which kind of make it so that the prefrontal cortex and other parts of the central control system come on to kids at different times and in different contexts and in different ways, right? That's what the story is. In some extreme states of exposure to toxic chemicals and other things, you can get severely dysregulated states where, but that's what we're talking, like that's a very rare compared to what we're looking at in schools today, where we're getting the prescriptions. And so the argument's something like, unless we change schooling and start to think radically differently about it, like in a concrete utopian way, like my educational hub network vision, where we're actually getting kids out of these intolerable situations and duplicitous situations and self-contradictory and meaningless and nonsensical situations, which is what school often feels like. We need to get them out of there, because if we don't, then we're just going to, ADD is just going to keep increasing and depression will keep increasing. And then there'll be an ADD meds and SSRIs, and then they'll have reactions to both of those. And
suicides and people.
Right. And so it ends up being, the kind of, the externalities of the system are being displaced into the bodies of the youth. And when I talk about a catastrophic bifurcation of intergenerational transmission being a kind of vector of civilizational collapse, those are
Moloch or something. It's like
it ends up looking, and it's a kind of generational warfare, actually. It's all being.
What do you mean generational warfare?
I mean, look at the debt, and then now look at the iatrogenic burden being placed on the youth. Like, what are we going to expect them to do? And what are we going to expect them to think of us for leaving them in this situation? So that feels to me like pretty rough.
Okay, so the plague is here, basically, is what you're saying. The plague is here.
I'm saying something like the plague is approaching, and we are the cause, and therefore the cause is unspeakable. And as a Rastafarian I knew said, he said, "Look how Babylon works. The schools make you stupid. The money makes you poor. The medicine makes you sick."
Yeah, all those things. Yeah.
Right. And so this is it. The system has reached a point where now it is turning into its opposite. Right. The system has grown to a point where now its internal contradictions are beginning to dissolve it in kind of its own.
Maybe that's the good news. Is it's sort of reached a level of toxicity that is becoming transparent. Like you can see it.
I hope so, but
before it was harder to see.
Well, it's getting harder to see because we're compromising our nervous systems as a result of the iatrogenic plague, right? So this is one of the main problems you have with certain forms of iatrogenesis, is that they affect the nervous system precisely in such a way that you can't recognize that you're compromised. So the people on the Senate floor, I think they're thinking clearly.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Like, I don't think they know that they're
Well, they're in the matrix, so
correct.
so,
Right. This is what I mean.
So
that,
that's what
right.
else do you expect them to do? But
Yeah.
Follow their programmed.
Right. So in the fog of the time between worlds, it's dicey, right down to the level of the biological substrate, and yeah. So we'll see. But yeah, so the iatrogenic term is very important, and hopefully another person or group will somehow bring attention to the issue that is not as polarizing as Peterson, so people can actually look through the simulation of the reality, and hopefully the addiction language around. So that's the one narrative you will see in the culture about problems with the medical industry. You'll see the addiction narrative, and that is actually a very interesting narrative because it ends up, in a sense, placing responsibility on the individual who is actually on the receiving end of the system, right? Most of the so-called addicts, even on opiates, were placed on them as part of surgical procedure or some other normal thing. And what you're looking at is actually something like physical dependency, which is different than the connotation of addiction. And so that's another thing that's running interference between culture actually seeing the iatrogenic
mass addiction.
Right.
Yeah.
It's of course very dangerous to even talk about this stuff because of the church and the difficulty with these issues. Because when you start to talk about these things, you're talking about illness, you're talking about death, you're talking about fear, you're talking about a lot of things that actually drive our behavior away from engaging with truth. So it's difficult. I find it very difficult to have the conversation. I'm glad we're having it, but I don't anticipate it being well received.